Black women are supposed to bow their heads and cry. Why are you standing up?" The officer's voice did not tremble. It thundered, loud enough for the wreath-bearers to pause, for the silence of a military funeral to rupture like torn cloth. His hand was already on his weapon. His boots dug into the soil as if he stood on a battlefield, not a cemetery. Officer Raymond Dole did not care that the crowd had gone still, that the air was thick with grief and ceremony, that a flag-draped coffin waited under the canopy. He cared only about control. He saw a black woman standing where, in his mind, she should not be. She stood tall, wearing the uniform of honor. Her eyes were dry. Her presence was unwavering. He shouted again, "Get on the ground." I said now. Children, in small military outfits, stared wide-eyed from their seats. A priest froze mid-prayer. 2 officers moved forward but stopped when they saw the gun drawn. Dole pointed the weapon directly at her chest. "You are not white. You are not welcome. Get back, or I will shoot." The woman did not flinch. She did not plead. She did not drop her. Her name was Elise Monroe, and the man pointing a gun at her had just signed the end of his career. He did not know her, but nearly everyone else present did. Some recognized her face from headlines, others from briefings or training videos. A few had once served under her command, but Dole knew none of that. He saw only her skin. He saw only defiance where he expected silence. The flag had not yet touched the coffin. The sky was still half gray with early mist. The air carried a March chill, the kind that wraps around the bones and holds memories tight. But this was no longer just a funeral. It was now a confrontation, and it was being watched. The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. It was fear and disbelief and restraint, all colliding in the lungs of every person present. Elise spoke once. "Lower your weapon." Her voice was calm, controlled, not a whisper, not a threat. Dole spat on the ground. "You do not tell me what to. You do not outrank me here." "I do," she replied. Those 2 words did more than echo. They rang like bells. One of the pallbearers stepped forward. "That is General Elise Monroe. 3 tours, 4 stars, commendation from the Secretary of Defense." Someone else said, "She once commanded 30,000 troops. What have you commanded?" Dole blinked. His hands shook for the first time. "She cannot just walk up here unannounced. This is a restricted zone." "It is her soldier in that casket," said the chaplain. And that was when the shift happened. From rows of black chairs, from beneath the quiet flags and the hanging branches of the old oaks, people stood. Not all, but enough. They rose not in anger, but in alignment. Dole saw it happening and stepped back. His gun still aimed, now with uncertainty. The wreaths at his feet were crushed. His authority had fractured. Elise Monroe did not move. She was, still holding the urn, wrapped in black cloth. It had belonged to Sergeant Maya Trenton, her driver, her scout, her friend. Killed by an IED while protecting a convoy, Elise had come to place that urn beside the casket, to say goodbye. Now, instead, she was being forced to face a weapon, not in war but in memory, not by an enemy but by a man who wore the same badge. She once saluted. A boy in the front row, no more than 7, leaned toward his father. "Is that man going to jail?" His father replied softly, "He will. He just does not know it yet." Elise finally took a step. Forward, no fear, no rush. Her boots on the grass made no sound, but her presence shook the ground more than the officer's shouting had. Dole tried to speak. Nothing came out. His mouth moved, but his words had been stolen by shame. 2 military police stepped in from the side. "Officer, remove your weapon, now." "No, she is the threat. You drew first and on a superior officer," one replied. "This ends here." Elise turned to them. "I do not want to ruin the ceremony. Let him leave quietly." But it was too late for that, the Ibur. Ceremony was already changed. It would be broadcast by nightfall. It would hit every screen, every feed, every household with a conscience. The story would not be about the soldier buried. It would be about the general nearly shot. Dole's weapon was taken, his hands cuffed. Still, Elise stood. She placed the urn gently beside the casket, knelt once, whispered something no one could hear. Then she rose and took her place beside the widow of Sergeant Trenton. There was no applause. There was no forgiveness. There was only the sound of boots on grass and a flag being folded. A few weeks later, in a courtroom flooded with cameras, Officer Dole would claim he had followed protocol, that he had feared for his life, that he had not known who she was, but the law did not side with the badge that time. It sided with the silence she carried, with the rank she had earned, and with the honor no gun could take away. To the unknowing, it looked like another formal goodbye, a slow-moving flag, a hush in the air, a procession of black vehicles guided through the front gates of Southgate National Memorial, where names were carved in white stone and boots marched, only with permission, but it was never just a ceremony. It was the return of silence to a woman who had been forged in noise. It was a goodbye to someone she had once led, protected, mentored, and it was supposed to be a sacred day until a man with a badge forgot what the uniform meant. Officer Raymond Dole had been assigned to perimeter watch, a routine detail. He was told to stay quiet, stay aware, and follow protocol. But Dole had never truly followed anything except his own pride. He saw a black woman walk toward the ceremonial area with a cloth-wrapped urn in her hands and decided she was a problem before he even knew her name. He had made up his mind before she ever opened her mouth. The moment he shouted at her, the entire energy of the space shifted. When he drew his weapon, it collapsed. The gun was pointed. The ceremony paused, and General Elise Monroe stood calm and still, while an officer threatened her life in front of veterans, family, children, and the very soldiers she had once commanded. By the time the weapon was lowered and Dole was escorted away, the silence had turned heavy, not respectful, not solemn, but stunned, the kind that follows a lightning strike no one saw coming. The ceremony continued out of necessity. The casket was lowered, the rifles fired, the flag was folded, but the people watching knew what they had witnessed. This was not just a funeral, this was a breach. When Elise Monroe stepped away from the flag line and stood beside Sergeant Maya Trenton's widow, she did not say a word. She placed the urn on the stone platform, stood back, and looked straight ahead. Her presence was not loud, but it made everything else go quiet. Later that evening, the footage began to circulate. It was filmed from behind a row of ceremonial chairs by someone with a steady hand and a furious heart. The clip was brief, but it captured everything: the shouting, the gun, the stillness of Elise Monroe. The exact moment she said, "I am General Elise Monroe. You just made the worst mistake of your career." Within an hour, the video had begun spreading. By midnight, it had reached 2 million views. By morning, it had tripled. And by lunch, Southbridge Police Department had its phones ringing non-stop. The department responded with a brief public statement: "We are reviewing the incident." That was all. But the city had already made its own statement. In living rooms, barbershops, schools, offices, and community centers, people watched the clip and asked the same question: how do you not recognize a general in uniform? And more, painfully, would he have pulled that gun if her skin had been white? It was no longer just about one officer. It was about the weight behind the badge and who it fell on. Inside the department, silence became a tactic. No internal update was shared. No disciplinary action was taken. The chief of police declined to comment. The mayor's office refused to issue a statement. But outside, in the city Elise had defended and returned to, voices grew louder. Veterans associations called for accountability. Civil rights groups demanded transparency. Retired officers released statements of support for Monroe. Few even showed up at her gate with their uniforms on, saluting quietly from a distance. But Elise herself said nothing, until the 12th day. That morning, a letter arrived, not from the mayor, not from the department, but from the Pentagon. It was hand-delivered and signed by the Secretary of the Army. "We are requesting full oversight of the incident and offering immediate legal counsel. We stand by General Elise Monroe." It was the first crack in the official silence. Elise appeared at a leadership seminar that evening, one she had agreed to attend long before the funeral. She stood before a class of young cadets, all in training to lead. No cameras, no reporters. Just curious minds and one question that had been growing all week. A cadet asked, "What were you thinking when the gun was pointed at you?" Elise waited, then answered, "I was thinking of Maya Trenton, of her mother, of the flag she served. Under in the flag she was buried beneath. And I was thinking how fragile respect becomes when fear is given a weapon." No one responded, but the message was received. Another cadet asked quietly, "Why did you not speak to the media?" Elise nodded. "Because there are moments where silence speaks louder. But now the silence is being used to bury what matters. So I will speak." The next morning, Elise held a brief press appearance. One podium, one camera, one statement. No one should need a title to deserve dignity. No one should have to earn their right to mourn without fear. This was never about one badge or one officer. This is about what we teach men in power, and who we allow them to see as threats. I am not an exception. I am a reflection. And this was not just a ceremony. It was a mirror. She stepped away before any questions could be asked. That single clip became its own headline. Across networks, the words were repeated. This was not just a ceremony, it was a mirror. Within 24 hours, national veterans groups called for the full investigation to be moved outside of Southbridge PD. By the end of the week, the Department of Justice had contacted city officials. An internal affairs inquiry was announced, quietly, without press. But that was no longer enough because the mirror was broken, and what it revealed could no longer be ignored. Elise Monroe never asked to be a symbol. She never planned to become the story. But when the camera caught her standing still while a uniformed officer shouted threats and pointed a weapon at her chest, she became something larger than she had ever intended to be. The public saw courage. They saw calm under pressure. But what they did not see were the decades that built that stillness. The decisions, the losses, the silence she had carried. Elise did not learn strength in a classroom. She learned it watching her mother grip the steering wheel tighter when pulled over in a quiet southern town. She learned it when her brother was told he was too aggressive for speaking calmly to a teacher. She learned it when the first man to salute her in uniform followed it with a whisper, "You are the first I have ever seen like you." And she learned it when Sergeant Maya Trenton died in her arms during a routine mission gone horribly wrong. Elise had not wanted a ceremony. She had only wanted to place the urn. The department, the officer, the moment none of it had been part of her intention. But now she was the face of something she could not ignore, and she was not going to shrink. When the Department of Justice confirmed it would monitor the investigation, Elise issued no statement. But behind the scenes, she was working. Quietly, deliberately, not to retaliate, to reveal. She requested access to internal data, records of all officer complaints over the last 5 years. She asked for video logs, body cam footage, officer suspension records. What began as a simple list turned into a pattern. What was first a question became a file. Clark Morrison, a legal advisor and longtime friend, joined her after reviewing the footage. "You are not just going to let them spin this, are you?" Clark asked. "No," Elise said. "But I am not going to yell. I am going to show." Together, they built a report organized, factual, undeniable. Over 20 complaints filed against Officer Raymond Dole during his tenure. 7 labeled inconclusive. 6 marked dismissed. 4 not logged properly at all. And 1 from 2 years ago involving a nearly identical accusation. Racial targeting during a memorial service for a fallen officer's family. Elise placed that one on the cover. "This is not a story about what happened to me," she told Clark. "This is about what keeps happening to people no one sees." As the investigation gained national attention, networks began requesting interviews. Elise declined most, but she did agree to one with a young black journalist who had covered Military justice stories with integrity and depth. The interview was quiet. No audience, no rehearsed lines. "Do you feel safe now?" the journalist asked. Elise responded, "Safe is not the same as seen." "Why did you not speak sooner?" "Because I was trained to hold my breath until the storm passed. And now, I have decided to breathe." Clips of the interview aired later that night. People listened. Some cried, others felt uncomfortable, but all of them watched, because the woman on screen did not shout. She did not accuse. She explained, in the calm voice of someone who had lived. Through too much to raise her voice unless absolutely necessary. Back at the Southbridge station, the pressure mounted. Protests formed outside the department gates, not loud or violent, but present, consistent. Elise's silence had done what shouting could not. It had forced the city to see itself. And still, she worked. She visited schools. She spoke with military recruits. She met with other women who had been silenced inside uniforms too heavy with expectation. One woman, a former officer named Tanya Reed, handed Elise a letter. It read, "I left the force because I was tired of being invisible. What you did reminded me I was not the only one standing alone." Elise folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her notebook. She did not reply. She just nodded. Because sometimes acknowledgement is the answer. The city issued a statement 2 days later. Effective immediately, Officer Raymond Dole is suspended without pay pending further investigation. The department acknowledges the seriousness of the situation and is cooperating fully with all legal authorities. To some, it sounded like progress. To Elise, it was just the beginning, because suspension was not accountability, and accountability was not just punishment. It was change, lasting, visible, irreversible change. She walked through the cemetery again, that weekend, alone, no cameras, no media, just Elise in the wind. She stopped beside Maya Trenton's grave and stood in silence for 5 full minutes. Then she whispered, "I will not let your memory become a lesson without action." Behind her, the sky was soft with early dusk. Ahead, the next battle waited not in combat but in courtrooms, in reports, in public spaces where people still asked if honor had a color. Elise Monroe's days began earlier now. She would wake before dawn, sip black coffee in her quiet kitchen, and scan the emails from her legal team, civil rights groups, and retired officers across the country who had begun offering statements and evidence from their own encounters with misconduct. Most addressed her with the same phrase, "Thank you for standing." But Elise did not feel heroic. She felt responsible. Because every thank you reminded her of how many had stayed silent before, not out of cowardice but exhaustion. One morning she received a package, no return address. Inside was a manila folder filled with printouts, complaint forms, handwritten reports, and internal memos. A note was tucked between the pages. These were marked for deletion. "I could not let that happen. Do not let them forget us." It was signed with only one word. Victor Clark reviewed the papers and said, "These are from inside. Someone wants the truth out." Elise replied, "Then let us make it impossible to hide." They began building a secondary file, not only on Officer Dole, but on the system that trained him, defended him, and kept him armed long after his judgment failed. The local paper ran a headline the next day, "Pattern or Exception." Closer look at Officer Dole's record. Inside were summaries of past complaints, several witness statements, and an anonymous source confirming Dole had once been removed from a training program for excessive force, but later reinstated. The department scrambled. Suddenly they scheduled a press briefing. The chief appeared before cameras and read carefully from a script. "We are committed to fairness and accountability. Officer Dole's actions are under full review, and we are cooperating with federal and military investigators." But they did not mention Elise by name. They did not apologize. They did not even say the word funeral. Elise watched the broadcast in silence, then turned it off. That same afternoon, she received a message from a student at the academy where she had once taught part-time. It read, "I used to think courage was shouting the loudest. Then I saw you. Stand still while a weapon was aimed at your heart. You did not move. You did not break. You just stood there and reminded everyone that not all wars need explosions to be felt. Elise closed her eyes and breathed. She thought of her father, a quiet mechanic who once told her, "Your dignity is not something you ask for. It is something you carry, even when others pretend not to see it." Now the world was watching, and they were beginning to see. At a town hall meeting, a woman in her 60s took the microphone and said, "I have waited my whole life to see someone in power, not back down when threatened. Thank you, General Monroe. You made it easier for the rest of us to walk tall." That night, Elise finally spoke at length to her own staff and team, not to prepare for war, but to prepare for truth. This will not be won by shouting. It will not be solved in one trial. But if we do not stand now when the cameras go away, they will forget again. And I will not allow that. I did not survive battlefield silence to return home and accept it here. She looked around the room. Some were crying. Some were nodding. All were ready. Because when a woman refuses to shrink, those around her remember how to stand. Truth does not always shout. Sometimes it hides buried in old folders, mislabeled boxes, and servers so outdated no one thinks to check them. That is where Elise Monroe turned her attention next. The public had seen the footage. The outrage had stirred the streets. But what Elise needed now was proof of a pattern, not just of one officer, but of a culture. Clark met her at the old military records annex just past the edge of the city. It was a cold, concrete building with peeling white paint and a flickering hallway light. Inside were decades of forgotten paper trails. No digital search tools, no shortcuts. "This is where real things go to disappear," Clark said. Elise looked around. "Then this is where we start." They were given 2 keys and access to a windowless records room stacked wall to wall with cabinets, many of them unmarked. Dust coated everything. The smell of old paper filled the air. Clark pulled out a drawer labeled disciplinary, internal use only. The files inside were thick, yellowed, and clipped with rusted metal bands. "Start with Dole," Elise said, "then move outward." The first file was dated 7 years ago. It was a handwritten complaint by a fellow officer who had witnessed Dole use excessive force during a parking dispute. The civilian involved had required stitches. The file included a brief note. Counseled. No further action. The second was even shorter. A mother had filed a complaint that Dole handcuffed her teenage son without cause. The entry was 2 sentences long. Officers stated the youth was non-compliant. File closed. They read quietly for hours, spreading files across 2 folding tables. Elise kept a notebook, writing down names, dates, patterns. By sunset, they had reviewed 18 complaints. 13 involved people of color. 10 were dismissed due to lack of evidence, even when medical records were attached. 5 had body camera footage listed as not recorded or missing. Clark leaned back in her chair. This is not neglect. It is intentional structure. Elise circled a name that kept appearing: Captain James Helton. He had signed off on most of the dismissals. "Find his record," she said. They located Helton's file in a separate cabinet. His evaluations were glowing. Reliable, disciplined, calm under pressure. But buried between the lines were small signals. Unexplained case closures, a complaint from a rookie officer who had claimed Helton told him, "We handle our own problems in-house." That complaint had been filed, and then marked retracted. Elise made a second list: Helton's approvals, Dole's misconduct, and the supervisors involved in each. The pattern was forming, but they needed more. They returned the next day, this time joined by Selena Grant, an internal affairs analyst who had worked in silence for years, but had always paid attention. Selena brought her own folder. These are incident logs from the body cam archive. I pulled them before they shut off my access. She handed over a list of video entries. Some had been watched. Some had never been opened. 29 were from patrols involving Dole. Only 8 had intact video. The rest were corrupted. Elise asked, How does video get corrupted that often? Selena replied, It does not. Not unless someone wants it. They compared Selena's list with the incident reports from the annex, and there it was. Case after case marked with vague phrases. Resisted questioning, non-compliant behavior, standard protocol applied. But the footage when it existed told a different story. In one video, a young man was held against a wall while asking, "What did I do?" over and over. The report said he was aggressive. The footage showed no such thing. Another showed Dole pulling a driver out of a car by the collar. The man was elderly, confused, had done nothing wrong. The report said he had reached for something under the seat. He had not. Clark looked at the growing stack. This is not just about Dole. This is about who let him keep going. Elise nodded. And who helped cover it? By the third day, they had compiled 57 entries with irregularities. Elise created a file named Intentionally Ignored. It held more than just papers. It held the silence of every person who had been told their word did not matter. She looked across the table at Clark and Selena. "We are not just writing a report," she said. "We are building a case, and we are going to hand it to every office that can no longer claim they did not see it." Outside, the sky had turned pink with early dusk. Inside, the three women worked by a single desk lamp and the quiet hum of truth being pulled back from the places. It was meant to die. 3 days into their quiet investigation, the file stack had grown so thick that they could no longer keep it in the annex overnight. Elise locked the documents in a secured cabinet at her law office and took home a duplicate binder marked with red tabs and hand-labeled dividers. At night, she read with her hand steady on a pen and her mind tracing every word for what was missing. The silence inside those reports was louder than gunfire. Every time a witness statement was left blank, Elise saw a voice ignored. Every time a video was marked as corrupted, she imagined someone hovering over a delete key and calling. The routine. And every time a signature reappeared, the same 3 names. Over and over, she circled it. Captain Helton, Deputy Wallace, and Internal Review Officer Jane Madsen. 3 names at the end of so many stories that never had a proper ending. Clark knocked on her door at 8 p.m. that Friday night. She carried a flash drive and a newspaper. "They are closing in," Clark said. "You will not believe this." She handed Elise the paper. The headline read, "Internal Review Officer resigns without notice amid backlash over funeral incident." The article was short. It mentioned Jane Madsen by name. She had reportedly submitted her resignation that morning and had left the department by lunch. No explanation, no public statement. Clark handed her the flash drive next. "This was in my inbox. No note. Just the drive. It contains scanned memos, some from Madsen's office, some from Helton's. It looks like someone on the inside is helping us." Elise plugged it into her laptop and opened the folder. Inside were documents stamped "Confidential," "Do not duplicate," and one titled "Contingency Planning, Officer Dole." She clicked. The memo detailed a departmental strategy for mitigating public exposure risk if Officer Dole's behavior ever escalated. It listed talking points, media protocol, and a quote that made Elise pause. Maintain narrative that officer acted in good faith under unclear conditions. Prior service record should be emphasized. Downplay disciplinary background as unverified hearsay. Clark stared at the screen. They were prepared for this. They knew he was unstable, Elise said. They built a shield for when he cracked. Selena joined them shortly after midnight. She had been reviewing access logs from the department's internal case management system. "I found something," she said, holding up her tablet. "There is a secondary account that accessed Dole's case files 3 hours before we got to the annex." Elise looked at her. "Who?" "Someone logged. And under Chief Wallace's credentials. But the digital signature belongs to Madsen. She copied multiple files, then deleted the view history." "They were watching us," Clark said. "No," Elise corrected. "They were trying to stay ahead of us." The next morning, Elise stood in her office looking out at the street below. Two protest banners waved at the far end of the block. One read, "Truth has a rank too." The other, "If she had fallen, we would have burned it all." She knew what they meant. The city had not ignited because Elise had refused to fall, because she had not cried or panicked or run. She had stood, and in doing so, she gave others time to catch up. But now that time was running out. She turned back to the files and began building the report. She labeled each section clearly: pattern of suppression, misuse of authority, failure to intervene, targeted misconduct by Officer Dole, administrative. Protection by supervisors. Each document was cross-referenced. Each video was logged. Each report was dated and marked. She printed 3 copies, one for the Department of Justice, one for the City Ethics Board, and one for the press. When she met with the federal oversight team 2 days later, she handed over the file without ceremony. "This is not about revenge," she said. "This is about every time you asked a citizen to trust the badge and gave them silence instead." They opened the binder and scanned the pages. One official looked up and asked, "Do you believe the department is corrupt?" Elise answered without blinking, "I believe corruption does not always look like crime. Sometimes it looks like approval. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all." Back at home, she sat with her coffee and stared at the urn on her mantel. Maya Trenton's, the woman she had come to honor. The soldier whose memory had been interrupted by a gun. The friend whose name had now become part of every headline. Elise whispered, "We are not done yet." The following morning, a televised panel gathered to discuss the case. One guest, a retired officer, said, "This goes beyond protocol. This is about who we let become the face of authority, and how that authority is taught who to see as a threat." Another guest, a civil rights lawyer, added, "They did not just fail to stop Dole. They built a system where he did not have to stop." The moderator concluded, "And now a general has forced us to look where we did not want to." By evening, Elise's report had been published in full online. It was downloaded over 50,000 times within 12 hours. The public was reading, and this time, the silence was not protective. It was proof that what had been hidden was no longer buried, and what had once been ignored was now undeniable. It began with a closed-door hearing. The city's Civil Rights Oversight Committee had called an emergency session. What was supposed to be a preliminary review of Officer Raymond Dole's conduct at the funeral had escalated into a full public inquiry after the release of Elise Monroe's report. At first, they tried to keep the room small. Only internal investigators, city officials, legal observers, and one seat for General Monroe. But silence does not shrink once the truth is out. By the time Elise entered the chamber, 3 overflow rooms had been opened to accommodate members of the press, veterans groups, and concerned citizens. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd stood quietly under flags and signs that read things like, "Honor means accountability," and "One rank does not silence another." Elise arrived in uniform, not to intimidate, to remind those inside the room that her presence was not political. It was earned, that her rank was not borrowed, it was built, and that her silence had not been fear. It had been restraint. As she took her seat, the room hushed. No gavel was needed. The first to speak was the lead investigator, a sharp-voiced attorney named Elliot Graves. He summarized the findings of the initial report, emphasizing the lack of protocol, the absence of body camera footage, and the questionable history of Officer Dole. Then came the moment no one expected. The committee chair said, "General Monroe, we would like to hear from you. Please stand." Elise rose slowly. Not a sound moved through the room. She did not walk to the podium. She stood where she was. "I came here to bury a soldier," she began. "I did not come to confront a weapon. I did not raise my voice, because I should not have had to." She paused. "I was trained to face danger with composure. But what I faced that morning was not war. It was something colder, something more dangerous, because it wears the clothes of protection and speaks the language of safety while targeting the people it is sworn to serve." One of the board members interrupted gently. Do you believe Officer Dole knew who you were when he drew his weapon? Elise looked directly at the woman who asked. I believe he saw everything he needed to make a decision before I said a word. I believe my uniform did not protect me from his judgment. I believe it made him angrier. Gasps rippled through the back rows, Elise continued. And I believe this committee, if it fails to act now, will become part of the silence that has allowed men like him to move unchecked for far too long. The chair leaned forward. You understand, General, this is not a trial, this is a review board. Elise nodded. Then let it review everything. Review my service. Review my record. Review my silence. And ask yourselves why the city has been forced to learn about its police department from a general's report instead of its own files. The room was still, but the silence had changed. It was no longer passive, it was heavy. The kind that comes right before the ground shifts. Behind Elise, a man stood. He was tall, white-haired, wearing a faded veteran's cap. He had not been on the speakers list, but he spoke anyway. I served in 2 wars, he said. I was there the day Elise Monroe led an entire platoon out of a burning village without losing a single life. I watched her kneel beside a dying man and speak to him like he was her own son. If this city allows that woman to be threatened without justice, it deserves none. Security began to step toward him, but the committee chair raised a hand. Let him finish. The man looked directly at the panel. When a man points a gun at a general during a funeral and still keeps his job a week later, that is not a department. That is a disease. He sat back down, and the silence cracked. Not with noise, but with knowing. Knowing that something had shifted, that a room built to control had become a room that could no longer contain the truth. Elise did not speak again. She did not need to. She had said enough. Now the room would have to decide what kind of silence it wanted to live with. The moment Elise Monroe stepped out of the hearing room, the crowd waiting outside erupted not with shouts or applause, but with silence. A silence built from respect, not fear. Dozens stood in uniform, some saluted, others simply nodded. Cameras flashed, but Elise did not stop to pose. She walked calmly through the line of people, carrying nothing but her truth and the weight of all the voices that had stayed quiet for years. Inside the chamber, the review board remained seated. Each member stared at the file Elise had submitted. None of them spoke for nearly 2 minutes. Finally, the chairwoman whispered, "This is not just about Dole." "No," said Graves, the investigator. "This is about a pattern." The badge gave him permission, but the silence gave him time. Word of the hearing spread quickly. By afternoon, media outlets were live outside City Hall. One reporter summarized it best. What happened in that room was not explosive. It was heavier than that. It was the quiet before the doors break. That evening, the city police department issued a second statement. Officer Raymond Dole has been placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of the review. We are also launching a formal investigation into past internal complaint processes to assess procedural breakdowns. To the public, it sounded like delay. To Elise, it sounded like fear. But it was not enough. The very next morning, she received an invitation to appear at a televised community hearing hosted by Southbridge United, a coalition of veterans, civic leaders, and civil rights attorneys. The event would not be official. It would be public, Elise accepted. The hearing was held in a university auditorium packed with 300 people. There were no nameplates, no gavels, just microphones and open seats. People spoke in turn. A mother stood first. Her voice trembled. "My son was arrested in front of our house for walking too fast. They called it suspicious. He was 15. He still sleeps with the light on." Next came a man in a wheelchair. "I served in Desert Storm. I came home with scars and medals. Then got pulled over for a broken taillight and ended up face down in gravel. They told me I was acting aggressive. My only weapon was my name." Story after story, face after face, Elise sat and listened to all of them. She did not interrupt. She took notes. She nodded. And when it was her turn, She stood up and walked to the microphone. "This is not a courtroom," she said. "And yet, more truth has been spoken here than in any official hearing I have attended in 20 years. She paused. "I want to thank every person who stood today. You reminded us that dignity is not a rank. It is a right." She looked across the room. "This city was built on service, but somewhere along the way, it stopped serving. That will change now, not because I say so, but because we are saying it together." The crowd stood, this time not in silence, but in shared purpose. Elise stepped off the stage and hugged the mother who had spoken first. She thanked every speaker by name. Later that night, the clip of her speech was played on national television. The segment ended with the anchor saying, "In a time where words are thrown like stones, General Elise Monroe uses them like bridges." Inside the police department, something cracked. 3 officers who had previously remained silent requested to speak with Internal Affairs. One delivered a full report of mismanaged complaints that had been ignored for years. Another turned over body camera footage that had never been logged. The third simply said, "I should have said something sooner." The department's press officer refused to comment, but the mayor could not. He appeared in a press conference the next morning. His voice was careful, chosen, weighted. The events of the past weeks have revealed serious failures in oversight, accountability, and judgment. While I cannot undo what happened, I can say this clearly. General Monroe was right. The silence ends now. Elise watched the broadcast alone in her kitchen. She did not smile, but she exhaled, because something had shifted. The room had broken, not with screams, but with voices that had finally stopped asking for permission to be heard. The courthouse steps had never seen a crowd like this. It was not a protest. It was not a parade. It was something in between, solemn, powerful, unmoving. Rows of people stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in silence. Many wore their uniforms, medals pinned neatly, caps pressed low. Others wore no insignia at all, just eyes, watching. Inside, the grand courtroom filled to capacity. The judge entered without formality. Today's pretrial hearing concerns the conduct of Officer Raymond Dole during the funeral at Southgate Memorial. The charges include misuse of authority, endangerment, and violation of military protection statutes. At the defendant's table, Dole sat still. No badge, no uniform, just a plain suit and a lawyer who looked like he already expected to lose. Elise Monroe entered from a side door. She wore her full military uniform, the same one she had worn on the day Dole pointed a gun at her. Every head turned, even Dole's. For the first time since the funeral, their eyes met across a room that was not under threat, but under oath. Elise took her seat. The prosecution called its first witness. It was not Elise. It was Sergeant Mason Burke, one of the guards present during the funeral. He testified clearly. "I saw Officer Dole approach the general. She did not move, she did not speak. He shouted, he pointed a weapon at her chest. There was no threat, only presence." The defense attorney tried to frame it differently. "Was the general within a restricted perimeter?" Burke replied. "She was the daughter of the deceased and a general. There is no perimeter that overrules that." The second witness was the elderly veteran who had stood up during the city hearing. He testified about Elise's battlefield history, her leadership, and her reputation among soldiers. "She could have broken that man's career with a phone call," he said. "But she waited. She gave this city time to decide if it wanted to do the right thing." Then the prosecution called Elise Monroe to the stand. The courtroom held its breath. She spoke without notes, without hesitation. "I stood still," she began, "because that is what I was trained to do in high-risk situations. But I also stood still because I knew the room needed to see what unchecked power looks like when it feels unchallenged." She looked directly at the judge. "This is not about what happened to me. It is about who was watching. Children, veterans, families. They saw a badge used as a weapon and a woman in uniform treated like a stranger. If the law means anything, It must mean something even when a general is involved. The courtroom was still. The judge asked, "What outcome do you seek, General Monroe?" Elise answered, "Not revenge, responsibility." When she stepped down, the crowd did not move, but something inside the room shifted again. The next witness was a surprise. It was Officer Lena Moore. She had been quiet since the day of the funeral. Now she took the stand and broke the silence. "I have worked with Officer Dole for 6 years. I ignored things I should not have. I let jokes slide. I watched files go missing. I told myself it was not my job to question it." She paused. "But the day he pulled a weapon on a general in front of children, I realized silence is a choice, and I am choosing not to be silent anymore." By the time court recessed for the day, the city was no longer debating whether Officer Dole had acted improperly. They were asking who else needed to answer. Outside, Elise walked through the crowd. People did not shout. They stepped aside. Not out of fear, out of respect, because the moment had broken the room, and now the room had broken its silence. Part 6. A quiet shift. 2,000 words. Change did not arrive in a wave. It came in whispers, in meetings held behind half-closed doors, in printed memos that no one wanted to be caught holding, in nervous glances exchanged by officers who had once spoken with certainty, but now answered every question with hesitation. At the Southbridge Police Department, the tone had changed. It began the day after the pre-trial hearing. The department's internal bulletin board, which had once been filled with birthdays, retirements, and community event flyers, now had a single document pinned to its center, a printed photo of General Elise Monroe in uniform, standing at the funeral. Beneath it, someone had typed the words, "Do not forget why this started." No one removed it. No one signed it either. It just stayed there like a flag someone forgot to lower. Inside the department, conversations grew quieter. Officers walked straighter. Jokes that once felt casual now died in throats before they reached the air. Even the veteran officers, those who had spent decades ignoring the slow erosion of public trust, now looked uncertain, because they knew what was coming, accountability, and they were not ready. Across the city, patrol reports began to change. Officers who had never worn their body cameras correctly now checked them twice before stepping out of the car. Supervisors began reviewing incident files in real time. Suddenly, people wanted documentation. People wanted signatures. People wanted to be on record, because the silence had broken, and in the vacuum it left, everyone could hear what had been ignored. At City Hall, a council member named Deandra Wells submitted a proposal for a full independent audit of the police department's complaint resolution process. It was not a press release. It was not for show. It was a binder filled with dates, missing records, and side-by-side comparisons of what the department reported versus what the public experienced. The binder was nicknamed The Ledger, and once it was handed to the Ethics Committee, copies began circulating through networks that reached far beyond city limits. One found its way into a state senator's hands. Another was opened by a national law journal. By the time Elise Monroe appeared on a televised interview with a national news anchor, the phrase systemic dismissal was trending across 3 platforms. In the interview, Elise remained calm. "I do not think every officer is corrupt," she said. "But I do think every institution has a decision to make. When the curtain is pulled back, will they fix what is broken, or will they pretend nothing was ever wrong?" The anchor asked, "What do you say to people who claim this is an isolated case?" Elise paused, then replied, "If it were isolated, we would not need a ledger." The segment was replayed throughout the day, and in places Elise would never see, classrooms, clinics, fire stations, people repeated her words, not loudly, not always in agreement, but they repeated them, because something had shifted. At the academy where Elise once taught, a current instructor rewrote part of the leadership curriculum. She titled the new section, "Authority Under Scrutiny," the right way to be questioned. And on the first day it was taught, the class stood and read a quote together before sitting down. The quote came from Elise's original press appearance. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear silence truth." At the same time, Officer Dole's legal team filed a motion to suppress certain evidence in the upcoming trial. They claimed it was prejudicial and lacked proper chain of custody. The motion was denied. The judge issued a short statement. "When ye see the eyes of a nation are upon a city, we do not hide. We examine." Back at the station, someone had added a second sheet of paper to the bulletin board. This one listed 10 names. Each name belonged to a person who had filed a complaint against Officer Dole in the last 5 years. Each case had been dismissed. At the bottom it read, "These are not ghosts, these are witnesses." Officers stared at the list. Some looked away, some read it twice. No one touched it. Elise walked into the city council building that afternoon to attend a private strategy meeting with the oversight committee. Before she could speak, the chair handed her a folder. Inside were preliminary plans to overhaul the department's internal affairs process, new leadership, new reporting structures, civilian participation, and a recommendation that the new policy be named after Sergeant Maya Trenton. Elise closed the folder gently. "She would have liked that," she said. The chair nodded. "It is long overdue." And in that room, without applause, without ceremony, something happened. A shift. Small but permanent. Elise Monroe had never been more visible in her life. And yet, she had never spoken less. She attended every scheduled hearing. She responded to every subpoena. She reviewed every page of documentation handed to her. But she did not speak unless it mattered. Her silence now had weight. Her words now had value, because the city was listening. And for the first time, it was also responding. The proposed overhaul of Southbridge's internal complaint system gained momentum. 2 council members who had originally hesitated now backed the measure fully. Their inboxes had been flooded with letters, not from politicians, not from activists, but from residents. People who said things like, "I have lived here for 20 years. I never thought I would see someone stand that tall and still be threatened. My daughter watched Elise Monroe on TV. She asked me why a woman in uniform had to defend herself at a funeral. I had no answer. I filed a complaint once. It disappeared. Now I understand why." Inside the department, a slow shift began to take hold. Captain James Helton submitted a formal request for retirement. No speech, no press, just a clean break. Those who had once stood behind him without question now found themselves revisiting memories that had been filed away as normal. One officer, a rookie at the time, remembered hearing Helton say, "We protect our own." At the time, he thought it meant solidarity. Now he realized it had meant secrecy. Selena Grant, still working quietly alongside Elise, found new names surfacing in old complaint chains. Some were junior officers pressured into silence. Some were civilians who had never even been told their cases had been reviewed. Each name was added to a growing index they now called the Forgotten File. It was no longer just about Dole. It was about every hand that helped him stay invisible. One name in particular stood out, Deputy Chief Leland Ross. Ross had signed off on 3 major policy decisions regarding complaint reviews. Each one had reduced oversight. Each one had passed without media attention. Each one now looked deliberate. Clark, Elise's legal advisor, raised the concern in a meeting with the city attorney. "We are not talking about negligence anymore. We are talking about protection, strategic procedural protection of men like Dole." The city attorney, a tired man, in his 60s, folded his hands and said, "You are building a case bigger than any one man." Elise replied, "Then the system should be big enough to answer for it." In the weeks that followed, Elise declined all major interviews. She focused instead on building her case, supporting the growing audit process, and attending quiet community events where her presence helped others find the courage to speak. One such event, a teenage girl approached her. "I want to be in uniform someday," she said. Elise looked at her and smiled gently. "You will, Just remember, uniforms are not protection, they are responsibility. That line was quoted in a statewide editorial published the following Sunday. It ran under the title, "When Honor is Earned Again." Meanwhile, new witnesses came forward. One was a retired officer who had worked with Dole in his early years. He submitted a written affidavit that read, "I warned my supervisors that Dole was unstable and aggressive. I was told to mind my beat and let leadership handle it. Nothing was handled, and now the whole city is handling the mess they allowed." The document was added to the official file. Elise reviewed it without comment. Then she turned the page and kept going. Because her focus was not just the trial, it was what came after. It was what would be rebuilt, one step at a time. Back at the station, the mood was no longer confusion. It was reckoning. New officers began speaking up. One turned in a report about an incident that had been intentionally misfiled. Another apologized directly to a woman whose complaint he had once ignored. A third said to his supervisor, "If we are not here to protect everyone, we are not really protecting anyone." Outside, murals of Elise Monroe had begun to appear, not commissioned, not paid for, just painted. One showed her standing between two rows of headstones, holding the urn, surrounded by silence. At the bottom, 3 words were written in black paint. She never flinched. Elise saw one on her way to a meeting and said nothing. But later that night, she lit a candle beside Maya Trenton's urn and whispered, "They are seeing it now." The shift had begun, not loud, not complete, but real. The day Elise Monroe received the subpoena for the federal inquiry, she was planting spring flowers in her backyard. She wore no uniform, no press watched, no ceremony followed. But when she read the envelope, she knew what it meant. The case had grown beyond Southbridge, beyond the city. It had become a national question. How many systems had built shields around men like Raymond Dole? And how many had trusted those shields more than the people they were meant to protect? Inside her home, Elise placed the envelope on the table and opened a notebook. She wrote a single line. "If the shift has begun, we must not stop walking." That week, the Department of Justice launched a full civil rights investigation into the Southbridge Police Department. A press briefing confirmed the scope. Use of force records, complaint handling, internal review procedures, and officer training protocols. Dating back 15 years, a representative from the DOJ addressed the public. "We do not investigate because of one incident. We investigate because one incident reveals what others have endured in silence." The city responded with a mix of panic and posture. The mayor issued a third statement in as many weeks, calling for full cooperation and accountability. The interim police chief resigned quietly. 2 captains were placed on administrative leave, and still, Elise said very little. But every time she showed up at a meeting, every time she submitted a report or passed through a hallway, people moved. Not out of fear, out of recognition that she had changed something. The day the DOJ team arrived in Southbridge, Elise was asked to meet with them in a closed-door session. The room was plain. No cameras, no audience, just truth. She answered every question. She submitted her files. She gave them names. But when they asked what she hoped would happen next, her answer surprised them. "I hope the officers who stayed silent look in the mirror and say something now." One of the investigators asked, "And if they do not?" Elise looked at him and said, "Then they never deserved the badge in the first place." Outside the courthouse, more murals appeared. This time, not just of Elise. One was of Sergeant Maya Trenton, her face gentle, her eyes steady, above her the words. She stood for her general. "Now her general stands for us." The city council passed the Oversight and Transparency Act by a unanimous vote. The act created a civilian-led review board with full subpoena power. It required monthly reporting on complaint, resolutions, and it banned internal file deletions without 3 levels of approval. The first document entered under the new system was Elise's full report. It was stamped and archived, but not hidden. It was published online for public view. That night, a teacher in another state printed it out and used it in her high school civics class. A mother who had lost her son to police violence wrote Elise a letter. I did not think anyone would ever hear us. You made the silence ring loud enough that they had to. Elise folded the letter and placed it with the others. She kept them all in a drawer beside the urn. Maya's urn. The same one she had tried to carry in peace before everything changed. Now, it sat at the center of the story, because memory has power, and Elise had chosen not to let hers fade. At sunset, she returned to the cemetery. No cameras followed, no speeches waited. She stood alone in front of the grave where the journey had started. Then, she whispered, the quiet shift is no longer quiet. She knelt beside the stone and laid a single medal at its base. Then she stood, not taller, just steadier, because the world around her was finally starting to rise as well. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they met. At first it was subtle. Emails that went unanswered, meeting rooms that were suddenly booked, clerks who swore they had never seen the files Elise was requesting, even though they had been logged. Just weeks before, then came the delays. The Department of Justice had requested access to archived internal communications between command officers and department heads. The request was lawful. The response was a vague letter claiming system updates had temporarily disrupted digital records. But Elise had been in too many war rooms to mistake delay for confusion. This was not a malfunction. This was sabotage. Clark noticed it too. She highlighted sections of the records that had been redacted. These are not minor edits, Clark said. Entire sections are gone. Not blurred, not blacked out. Gone. Selena, working alongside them, traced login activity. On the internal portal, a single name kept showing up at odd hours. Deputy Chief Leland Ross. He had been placed on leave pending inquiry, yet he still had access. When Clark brought this to the Oversight Committee, they froze. That is not possible, the chair said. It is not only possible, Clark replied. It is logged. The committee authorized an emergency shutdown of his credentials, but the damage had begun. Files Elise needed were already missing. They pivoted. Instead of chasing digital ghosts, they went to paper. Inside an unused records room beneath the public safety building, they found 3 boxes labeled Personnel Internal, pending clearance. Inside was a folder with no name on the tab. Elise opened it. Photocopies of complaint statements. Handwritten notes. One line repeated in 3 reports. He was warned about her. He said she needed to learn who was in charge. The handwriting matched. A memo they had previously seen in Ross's file. Clark whispered, "He was talking about you." Elise nodded. "I know." The room was quiet for a moment, then Elise stood. "Get copies, all of it. If they are trying to bury this, it means it is worth more than we thought." Outside, the media was catching wind of internal friction. A local station aired a segment titled, "Is the Southbridge PD blocking its own reform?" The piece detailed missing records, unexplained retirements, and Elise's federal testimony. When asked to comment, the city released a brief statement. "We are cooperating with investigators and declined to speculate on unverified reports." But someone inside the department was not staying silent. Elise received an anonymous envelope. No return address. Inside was a photo of Officer Dole from 3 years ago. He was standing with 2 other officers and Deputy Chief Ross. They were smiling. Behind them, a whiteboard listed training sessions and a phrase written in bold marker. "No weak links. Loyalty over optics." On the back of the photo, one sentence had been typed on a label. He was protected from day one. Elise showed the photo to Clark and Selena. Selena said, "They knew what he was. They built around it." Clark added, "This is what internal corruption looks like. Not loud, not sloppy, organized." They prepared a supplemental brief for the Department of Justice and included the photo. At the next federal check-in, Elise handed over the evidence. The lead investigator reviewed the photo carefully, then he said, "We have been waiting for something like this." "You knew?" Elise asked. "We suspected. But suspicion is not enough. Now they had a path, and Elise intended to walk it, but the department had one more move. That evening, the internal server crashed completely. The department blamed a software update, but IT logs showed no such process. When the oversight committee demanded answers, the official response was, "The system failed. Backup restoration is underway." Elise stared at the headline the next day. City system crashes after DOJ request. Coincidence or cover-up? The answer was clear. They were trying to kill the investigation, and that meant Elise would have to bring it back louder than before. When the department's internal server crashed, Elise Monroe did not panic. She prepared. She had seen systems fall before. Sometimes they fell from foreign interference, sometimes from weak code, but most often they fell because someone on the inside pushed the button. She and Clark met with the Department of Justice investigators the morning after the crash. The officials looked tired, concerned. One investigator said, "There is no technical reason this should have happened. What we have is either gross incompetence or intentional sabotage." Clark replied, "You know which one it is." The lead investigator nodded. "But we still need more. We need proof this was not just a glitch." Selena, working late the night before, had tracked server access logs from a mirrored workstation deep inside the department's training division. She handed over a printed screenshot. At the top was a timestamp just minutes before the system, failure, and beside it a name, L. Ross, the name that kept coming back, the one that now moved from suspicion into confirmed action. Elise leaned over the document. "This is not just misconduct. This is obstruction." The DOJ team agreed. They initiated an emergency preservation order for all remaining department data, but they were already behind. Elise knew it, so she went public. At a small press conference held outside a local veterans hall, she stepped up to a podium and addressed the crowd. "We now have evidence that individuals inside the Southbridge Police Department have not only failed to protect the public, but have actively worked to erase their responsibility for that failure." She did not raise her voice. She did not point fingers. She laid out facts. The server crash, the deleted files, the false maintenance claims, the repeated presence of Deputy Chief Ross in the chain of interference. The press captured every word. It aired that evening across state lines. The pressure mounted. Inside City Hall, officials scrambled to avoid fallout. Councilwoman Deandra Wells introduced an emergency motion to freeze departmental budgets for all divisions under internal review. Her proposal passed by a narrow margin. It was the first fiscal punishment the department had faced in decades, and it would not be the last. 2 days later, an anonymous whistleblower came forward. He worked in IT support. He confirmed that no system update had been scheduled at the time of the crash. In a signed statement, he said, "The department asked us to say it was an accident. It was not. Someone triggered a purge command manually, and I believe it was ordered from high up." The DOJ added his testimony to their formal investigation. By now, the city had divided. Some residents called for the department's full restructuring. Others defended it, saying a few bad decisions should not take down an entire force. But no one could deny what was happening. The news ran a panel. One guest, a former district judge, said, "This is not a collapse. It is an unveiling." Another replied, "The system is reacting the way systems do when cornered. Not with reform, but with destruction of evidence." Elise stayed steady. She held meetings. She attended hearings. She worked in quiet rooms while others raised their voices outside, because she knew where this was going, and she knew what it would cost. She returned to the cemetery that evening, the same place it began. She walked the rows alone, stopping once at Maya Trenton's grave. She sat on the cold stone bench beside it. She spoke softly. "They are trying to kill the truth, Maya, but I have seen truth survive worse." She sat there until the sun disappeared. Then she stood. She checked her phone. 3 messages, one from Clark, one from Selena, and one from an unknown number. The message was short. "You are being watched. Stay alert." Elise stared at it for a long time. then deleted it and turned the screen off, because she had always known that telling the truth would cost something. But she had never intended to stay silent, and now neither would the city. Within 72 hours of the whistleblower's statement, the investigation shifted from oversight to enforcement. The Department of Justice dispatched a full compliance unit to Southbridge. Their orders were clear: conduct on-site evaluations, secure digital systems, and audit every complaint record that had passed through the hands of Deputy Chief Leland Ross. Ross vanished. His home was found empty. His phone disconnected. The department claimed he was on extended personal leave. Elise did not believe that for a second. This was not leave. This was flight. Clark watched as the press closed in on the story. They will find him. The question is, will he take others down with him? The answer came sooner than expected. An emergency session of the City Ethics Council was called. The mayor appeared with his legal team and read a prepared statement. After reviewing evidence of data interference and breach of public trust, we are requesting criminal charges be filed against former Deputy Chief Leland Ross. Elise was seated in the third row. She did not move, but inside something shifted. Not satisfaction, not relief, but recognition. That for the first time, the city was admitting what it had always tried to hide. Ross was no longer protected. He was the example now. The next morning, Elise was contacted by a national broadcast network. They requested a sit-down interview to discuss the investigation, the system collapse, and the personal cost of standing alone for so long. She accepted. The interview aired in prime time. The anchor began with a question no one had asked her publicly. Yet, what made you walk forward instead of away when the gun was drawn? Elise looked at him, calm as ever. I was tired of leaving things broken. The anchor asked, did you expect the consequences to reach this far? Elise answered, I did not expect anything. I prepared for everything. She spoke clearly, without dramatics, without self-congratulation. She mentioned Maya Trenton. She acknowledged the families who had filed complaints and never received answers. She quoted a line from her father. Dignity is not something you ask for. It is something you carry. The interview went viral within hours. Viewers called her a commander of quiet resistance. Some called her the calm before a reckoning. Others just called her necessary. Meanwhile, back in Southbridge, the investigation reached deeper. Internal audits revealed 2 other officers had helped Ross bypass digital locks. Both were suspended and faced internal review. The city's Internal Affairs Office was temporarily placed under federal management. Files previously marked unrecoverable were partially restored from third-party backups. And in those files, more names emerged. Names of victims, names of protectors, names of those who had raised concerns long before Elise ever stepped into the line of fire. Elise read everyone. She began to build a new ledger, not of failure, of voices, a registry of those who had been silenced and those who were now willing to speak. It was not formal, not legal, but deeply personal. She called it the testimony we were never allowed to hear. She shared the stories during community forums. She read their words aloud, not to expose pain, to prove it had been real. One forum ended in silence, not because no one had something to say, but because the weight of what had been hidden for so long could no longer be denied. When Elise stepped outside after one event, a woman stopped her. She did not speak at first. She just hugged her, then said, "You made us visible." Elise looked at her and said, "You were never invisible. They just never turned their heads." The investigation continued for weeks, and Elise stayed steady. She kept showing up, kept documenting, kept refusing to disappear. Because the more they had tried to kill the investigation, the more they had proven why it mattered. And now, the nation was watching. The courtroom was not packed with noise. It was packed with silence, the kind that settles when a room knows something irreversible is about to happen. Reporters sat stiffly in the back row. Uniformed officers lined the edges, and Elise Monroe sat front and center, her expression unreadable. her posture unshaken. It had been 11 months since the day Officer Raymond Dole pointed a loaded weapon at her in front of the flag-covered coffin of Sergeant Maya Trenton. Now, the trial had begun. The prosecutor stood first. He was a man known for his restraint, the kind who preferred facts over passion. He opened with a simple sentence. "This is not a trial about confusion. It is a trial about choice." He outlined the events of that morning, step by step, from the moment Elise's vehicle entered the cemetery to the moment Dole's gun was taken from his hand. He read the internal records. He displayed the complaint. Logs. He played the footage. Then he paused. There will be those who say this was a misunderstanding. But misunderstanding does not look like a finger on a trigger. Misunderstanding does not ignore rank, uniform, or honor. Misunderstanding does not draw a gun at a funeral. He let that sentence sit in the air. The jury listened. Some nodded, some stared straight ahead. Then the defense rose. Their attorney was younger, sharper. He leaned into the podium with a rehearsed calm. My client was doing his job. He was securing a federal property during an active ceremony. He had no way of knowing the woman he saw was a general. She was not on the security roster. There had been no identification. He turned slightly toward the jury. And while hindsight is easy, protocol is not. What he did was follow training. Elise felt her jaw tighten. The prosecutor objected to the term training. The judge sustained it, and the trial moved forward. Witness after witness was called. First, the chaplain, then the widow of Sergeant Trenton, then a young soldier who had been holding a flag at the moment Dole shouted. He pointed the gun like, "It was nothing," the soldier said, "like we were not even there." Officer Lena Moore took the stand. She spoke slowly, deliberately. "I was trained to follow the law. That morning I realized we had been trained to follow each other instead." The room was still, and finally Elise was called. She stood and walked to the stand without ceremony. The oath was given. She answered questions with precision. Yes, she had been invited. Yes, she had identified herself. No, she had not been armed. Yes, she had held the urn of a fallen soldier under her command. When asked how she felt in that moment, Elise paused. "I felt like every medal I had ever earned meant nothing. I felt like my name did not matter. Only my skin." A reporter in the front row quietly lowered her pen. The judge asked for order. Elise continued. "I did not flinch, because I have been trained not to. But I should not have needed training to be treated like a human being." She stepped down after 10 minutes. That was all it took. The jury watched her walk back to her seat. No one spoke, not even the defense. The courtroom closed early that day. As Elise stepped outside, a crowd stood behind the barricades. They did not chant. They did not cheer. They just stood, watching and waiting. Because this trial was no longer about one man, it was about what kind of silence a city would accept. By the second week of the trial, the courtroom had begun to feel less like a legal space and more like a reckoning chamber. There was no dramatic shouting, no surprise objections, just a slow, careful peeling away of everything that had once been protected by silence. The prosecutor introduced new evidence. A body cam recording from a patrol 6 months before the funeral. The footage showed Officer Dole interacting with a young man outside a gas station. The man was calm. Dole was not. He barked orders, shoved the man against a wall, and placed him in cuffs without a clear reason. The recording ended with the young man saying, "You treat me like I already did something wrong." The courtroom was silent as the clip played. The prosecutor turned to the jury. This was not a one-time error. It was a pattern. And patterns do not come from panic, they come from permission. The defense objected to the introduction of prior conduct. The judge overruled. The trial continued. Testimony shifted from what Dole had done to what the department had allowed. Former officers testified about the atmosphere of fear and favoritism. Inside the force, one recalled seeing reports altered before submission. Another admitted that a supervisor had once said, "Do not escalate problems, just delete them." A third, with visible regret, confessed, I filed a complaint about Dole 3 years ago. It was returned with a note that said, "Do not pursue this further unless you want to move divisions." I stayed quiet. That is on me. By the time the court recessed for lunch, the pressure inside the room was no longer quiet. It was thick. It was visible on the faces of jurors, in the tapping fingers of reporters, in the way people shifted in their seats but said nothing. When the trial resumed, the defense changed tactics. They tried to portray Elise Monroe as intimidating. They brought up her rank, her medals, her presence. They asked why she had not left the area sooner, even after Dole raised his voice. Elise did not rise, but Clark, seated in the gallery, leaned forward slightly. The prosecutor stood. Are we really questioning why a general attending a funeral for her fallen soldier did not flee when a man pointed a gun at her? The judge called for order. The defense backed down. But the question had already collapsed under its own weight. Later that afternoon, a surprise witness was called. The IT specialist who had originally exposed the server crash. He was nervous. Young, but determined. He confirmed that the server had not crashed by accident. He confirmed that Dole's disciplinary history had been flagged for deletion 2 days before the incident at the funeral. And he confirmed that Deputy Chief Ross had attempted to erase body cam logs. The room reacted without noise, just tightened jaws, just deeper breathing. Just a jury that now understood this was not just about what happened in a cemetery. It was about a structure, a chain of command. A legacy of silence that had rotted through every layer of the badge. When Elise left the courtroom that day, she walked past a line of cadets from the academy. They stood with their hands behind their backs. Each wore a pin with the initials MT for Maya Trenton. One cadet whispered as she passed, "You made the silence stop." Elise nodded but said nothing, because the silence had not stopped. It had changed form. It had turned into attention. And attention, when placed on truth, can be the loudest thing in the world. The jury deliberated for 10 hours, not because they disagreed, but because they understood the weight of the decision. Because when the system has failed for years, even the right choice feels like a burden. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse all morning. Veterans leaned against flagpoles. Teachers canceled afternoon classes so students could watch the news together. Mothers waited in cars with their radios on. Fathers stood in silence outside church doors. At exactly 3:07 p.m., the court was called back into session. Elise Monroe sat in the front row. She did not shift. She did not blink. She simply listened. The foreman stood, paper in hand, and read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Raymond Dole, guilty on all counts. There was no cheer, no outburst, just a stillness so complete it felt like the entire city was holding its breath. The judge asked if the jury recommended immediate sentencing. The answer came without pause. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned to Dole. Mr. Dole, you are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. This court finds that your actions were not only a violation of law, but a breach of trust so severe it endangered the very system meant to protect. Dole said nothing. His attorney lowered his head. A bailiff stepped forward. Cuffs were placed on Dole's wrists. He was walked out the same way he had entered rooms for years, with a badge, a gun, and unchallenged power. But now he had none of those. Only silence. Elise closed her eyes briefly, not in celebration, in closure. Because justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper that finally gets to finish its sentence. Outside, the crowd remained quiet. The verdict spread, not by shouts but by nods. People passed the news without exaggeration. Guilty. Life. No parole. That night, the city light seemed dimmer, not in mourning, in reflection. At a small veterans gathering, Elise was asked to speak. She declined. Instead, she handed the microphone to the widow of Sergeant Maya Trenton. The woman stood, voice shaking, and said, "My husband always told me that truth moves slowly. But once it starts, it cannot be stopped. Today, I believe him. The room stood in silence. Then, one by one, they sat. No applause, just understanding. Later, Elise walked through her neighborhood. She passed murals of Maya. She passed signs that said, "Honor has a voice now." She passed children who waved without knowing the full story. And then she stopped by a small wall where someone had written, "She stood still so others would not have to." She looked at it for a long time, then turned and kept walking. Because justice had been served. But the work was not done. The courtroom was empty now. The cameras were gone. But what remained was louder than all of it. A verdict that spoke without sound, and a city that had finally decided to listen. The days that followed the verdict felt different. Not loud, not joyful, but quieter in a new way. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, but the sky has not yet remembered how to be blue. For the first time in nearly a year, Elise Monroe slept in. She did not wake to messages, court summons, or press inquiries. She woke to sunlight pushing through her curtains and the sound of birds that seemed, for once, louder than her own thoughts. In the kitchen, she made coffee without checking her phone, and for 20 minutes she did nothing. No folders, no interviews, no speeches, just silence. But even peace had its edges. Later that day, she received a letter from a woman in North Carolina. It read, "My son was arrested last year for defending himself against a false accusation. No one believed him. But when he saw what you did, he said, 'Maybe they will listen now.' Thank you for being louder than the ones who tried to silence you." Elise folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the others. That drawer had become a record of truth, not in court-approved language, but in lived experience. Each letter proof that silence had never meant consent. It had meant exhaustion. Now voices were returning. At Southbridge High School, a history teacher rewrote a section of her civic curriculum. She titled it, "Modern Acts of Courage." The first page featured Elise Monroe. The second featured Maya. Trenton. A student asked, "Why is she on this list if she did not fight in a war this year?" The teacher answered, "Because sometimes standing still is the most dangerous thing you can do." In the city council, new measures were proposed. One focused on preventing internal data deletion, another on mandatory independent review of all high-risk interactions. A third required all senior officers to attend bias training conducted by civilian educators. Some argued the policies were too much, too fast, too driven by emotion. But most voted yes. Not because they wanted to, because they had seen what happened when they did not. In the background, Elise continued her work. She met with cadets. She reviewed training material. She walked quietly into meetings where people used to avoid eye contact and now stood to greet her. But she never raised her voice. She did not need to. One afternoon, she returned to the cemetery. No event, no cameras, just Elise and the headstone that marked the beginning of everything. She sat on the bench beside Maya's grave and placed a single ribbon on the stone. On the ribbon, 3 words had been printed, "You did not fall." Elise sat there for almost an hour. Then she stood. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small folded card placed under a flower vase nearby. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "You made her story permanent. Thank you." There was no signature. Elise tucked it into her jacket and walked back to her car. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. She declined. Instead, she sent a letter. It read, in part, "I am not here to be a token of reform. I am here to be a mirror. If your officers can look into it and not flinch, then you are on the right path. If they cannot, then start again." The letter was read aloud by the conference host. It was met with a standing ovation. And still, Elise stayed home, because the work had never been about appearances. It had always been about truth, and now the truth had roots. The changes did not come all at once. They came in clusters, scattered like seeds that had waited for the storm to pass. At Southbridge Police Department, the front lobby had once displayed portraits of decorated officers. A new section had been added, Not photos, just names. A single plaque labeled "Voices that were ignored." Below it were 10 names. People who had filed complaints, testified in court, or stood against silence when it would have been easier to walk away. One of those names was Maya Trenton. Another was Elise Monroe. The plaque became a stopping point. For new recruits during orientation, they were told, "These names are not warnings, they are reminders." Elise visited once. She said nothing, just read each line, then walked away. She had started keeping to herself more. Not out of fear, out of clarity. The noise had subsided, but the work was far from finished. One morning, she met Clark for coffee. They sat by the window of a quiet diner where no one asked for photos or statements. Clark slid a document across the table. "They are asking you to speak at the State Ethics Summit." Elise shook her head gently. "I said no last year. The answer is still no." Clark smiled. "They are afraid you will say yes one day." Elise replied, "Good. Let them stay afraid. It keeps them listening." Selena arrived a few minutes later with a flash drive. "I found more suppressed files, archived from a backup server someone forgot to disconnect." Elise took it without surprise. "Add them to the record. The truth will need to survive long after we do." That became her new focus: preservation, not reaction. She created a secure archive separate from city databases, containing everything: court records, internal memos, testimony, letters, images, timelines, and notes. She called it the record they tried to erase. Clark offered to help digitize and publish it under an open access license. "It should be teachable," Elise said. "Let it stand as evidence for the next person who is told to stay quiet." Meanwhile, the country kept watching. Other cities opened similar investigations. Other departments reviewed their internal affairs processes. And though Elise was not physically present in those rooms, her name came up again and again, not as a hero, but as a reference point. She had become the example of what stillness could accomplish when the world expected you to step back. At home, she spent her afternoons in the garden, hands in soil. Phone inside. She said little, but the neighbors greeted her now with different eyes, respectful, honest. One child rode past on a bicycle and shouted, "Hi, General Monroe!" Elise smiled but did not correct her, not because the title mattered, because the recognition had changed. It was no longer about fear or myth. It was about acknowledgement. Later that month, she received a sealed envelope from the governor's office. Inside was an offer to lead the newly formed Commission for Institutional Accountability. She declined, but she agreed to advise quietly. She wrote her recommendations on paper in longhand, without a single flourish, and at the bottom of the page she signed only one sentence: "If the truth must come slowly, then let it come without compromise." That note was framed and placed in the office of the new commission head. Visitors read it before every meeting, and outside Southbridge, Elise became less visible, but more permanent. Her presence no longer required attendance, because her silence had already spoken, and people had finally learned to listen. Elise Monroe never wanted a statue. She never asked for plaques or ceremonies or parades, but the city of Southbridge insisted on remembering. They did not build a monument of her face. Instead, they installed a simple black stone wall near the front gates of the public memorial garden. It stood 4 feet high, smooth and quiet, with no names carved in bold. Just one phrase engraved across the center. She refused to bow when silence demanded it. Underneath, in smaller font, the names of those who came forward filled the base. Not just Elise, not just Maya, but the students who testified, the veterans who stood, the officers who changed. Every name told a story. Every story had once been ignored. Now, they would remain. On the day the wall was unveiled, Elise stayed home, not out of protest, out of principle. That evening, she visited the wall alone after the crowd had gone. She ran her fingers along the stone. She read the names in silence, and then she placed a folded note at the base. It read, "To everyone who stayed standing when it would have been easier to kneel, thank you." No signature, no camera, just truth, placed gently where it belonged. In the weeks that followed, the Southbridge Police Department announced a new leadership structure. Civilian review boards were implemented across all precincts. Recruitment standards were revised. Training programs now began with a session titled The Duty to Speak, and across the country, similar shifts began to take shape. Elise remained in the background. Her presence was felt, not seen. She answered only the calls that mattered. She wrote letters when needed. And when the Department of Justice finally closed its investigation with a full report, Elise read every page. At the very end, the report stated, "This case demonstrated how individual action can challenge systemic silence." The investigation would not have progressed without the integrity of General Elise Monroe. Elise closed the document and whispered, "Then may the next one come sooner." In the fall, a university requested her presence at a commencement ceremony. Not to speak, just to sit, to be there, to represent what strength looked like without applause. She agreed. At the ceremony, a student read a short tribute to the woman who stood without shouting, who proved that standing still is not the absence of action but its purest form. Thank you for letting the world see what honor looks like when it walks alone. The crowd rose. Not for spectacle, for recognition. Later, Elise returned home and placed her graduation program inside the same drawer as the letters and the original court transcript. She looked at the urn on her mantel, Maya's, then turned and stepped outside, where the wind moved quietly. Through the trees. That night she lit a candle by the window. No reason, no holiday, just a gesture, because silence had once been the weapon used against her. Now, it was the space where memory lived, and she had learned how to fill it, not with revenge, not with noise, but with the kind of truth that does not fade, not even after the applause stops, not even after the headlines end, because some stories are not meant to disappear. They are meant to stand, just like she did. The reckoning did not begin in a courtroom. It began in a classroom. 3 weeks after the verdict, Elise Monroe was invited to visit a community college in the neighboring city of Fairbridge. She had declined countless offers to speak since the IA trial, but this time she said yes, not for the stage, for the students. She entered quietly through a side door and took a seat at the back of the lecture hall. The professor, a retired civil rights attorney, introduced her without drama. In the room with us today is someone who did not fight with noise, but with presence. General Monroe, thank you for joining us. No standing ovation followed. Just a room that fell still out of respect. Elise stood and spoke for only 10 minutes. She did not talk about the trial. She did not mention Dole. She talked about trust. How do we ask the public to trust us, she said, if we are not willing to look inward? The badge does not clean the soul. It reveals it. One student raised his hand. What do we do when the system does not listen? Elise answered, You speak anyway, because silence is not the absence of sound. It is what lives in place of. If you do not fill it with truth, someone else will fill it with fear. The session ended without fanfare, but the air felt different, like a thread had been tied between what had happened and what would come next. Outside, Clark waited near the sidewalk. They are still asking about a documentary, he said. Every network wants it. Elise shook her head. Let them make their own version. I am not a headline. He smiled. You are a chapter, though, and the next one is starting. That chapter arrived sooner than expected. The Southbridge State Attorney announced that a new case had been opened. Not against Dole. His sentence had already been handed down. This case targeted the senior officers who had enabled him. Among those named was former Deputy Chief Leland Ross. He had been found living under a false name 3 states away. When arrested, he did not resist. He simply said, it was never supposed to get this far. The arrest triggered a second wave of audits across Southbridge. Old complaint files were reopened. Backups were combed for redacted memos. A former administrative officer testified that she had been ordered to destroy evidence and had refused. I knew if I did it, someone else would, she said, and that made me stop. Her testimony became a spark. More internal staff began speaking. some with guilt, some with clarity, all with purpose. The phrase, final reckoning, began circulating in the press. But Elise did not repeat it, because for her, reckoning was not about punishment. It was about correction, a city correcting its course, a system correcting its loyalty. One morning, Elise stood at the mirror and noticed how tired her eyes looked. She thought of her mother, how she used to say, "Time will not ask your permission to pass. You just have to decide what it leaves behind." Now, Elise looked around at what had been left, a city that was learning, a force that had bent but had not broken, a public that no longer whispered when they saw injustice. She put on her jacket, laced her boots, and left her house without a destination. She just walked, because reckoning does not always come like thunder. Sometimes it comes as footsteps, steady, quiet, forward. The trial of Leland Ross did not draw the same crowds. There were no national headlines. No news trucks parked for days. Just a few quiet reporters, legal interns with notebooks, and a handful of local citizens who understood what was really happening. This was not a spectacle. It was the repair of something once ignored. Ross sat calmly at the defense table. His suit fit too well. His expression never cracked. Even as the prosecutor read the list of charges, obstruction, evidence tampering, abuse of authority, he showed no reaction. Elise did not attend the trial. She had already said everything she needed to. But her files were there, her notes, her timeline, her questions, the same ones the courtroom. Now read aloud. Why were certain records deleted before a DOJ visit? Why were complaints closed without review? Why did Ross approve training budgets that specifically reduced bias education? One witness, a former operations supervisor, answered the last question with a sigh. He said training was for optics, that loyalty mattered more. The courtroom did not gasp. It just grew still, because by now no one was surprised, only sad and exhausted. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury returned in one. Ross was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to 12 years without parole. He said nothing as the cuffs clicked closed, but outside a group of cadets from Southbridge stood quietly in uniform. One of them whispered, "That is what accountability looks like." The others said nothing. They just stood straighter. Back at home, Elise read the verdict in the paper. She circled one line and pinned it to her fridge. The culture of silence was not broken by volume. It was broken by steadiness. Later that week, she walked through the training facility she once helped design. The building had changed. Walls once bare now displayed quotes from community members. One read, "It should never take a general to prove a person's worth." Elise paused there. She read it twice. Then she walked into the observation room where a new class of recruits sat in silence as an instructor played footage from the funeral. Clysters watched as Officer Dole raised his weapon. They watched as Elise stood still. The instructor asked, "What should have happened next?" A recruit replied, "He should have put the weapon down and asked her name." Another said, "He should have seen her before he saw a threat." The instructor nodded. "Then make sure you carry that answer into every room you enter." Elise stood behind the glass. She said nothing, but her eyes closed gently, and when they opened, she saw something she had not seen in a long time. Understanding. Not fear, not defense, just understanding. That evening she sat with Clark on the back porch of her home. The sky was clear, the air still. He handed her a copy of the final review from the Federal Oversight Committee. "It is done," he said. "No more hearings, no more redactions, everything is public." Elise flipped through the pages. One line stood out. General Monroe's documentation formed the backbone of this inquiry. Without it, the truth would have remained hidden beneath procedure. She folded the report and said, "Now we find out what they do with it." Clark nodded. "And what you do without it." Elise looked out over the quiet street, because reckoning was never just about what came down. It was about what would rise after. The trial of Leland Ross did not draw the same crowds. There were no national headlines, no news trucks parked for days. Just a few quiet reporters, legal interns with notebooks, and a handful of local citizens who understood what was really happening. This was not a spectacle. It was the repair of something once ignored. Ross sat calmly at the defense table. His suit fit too well. His expression never cracked. Even as the prosecutor read the list of charges, obstruction, evidence tampering, abuse of authority, he showed no reaction. Elise did not attend the trial. She had already said everything. She needed to, but her files were there, her notes, her timeline, her questions, the same ones the courtroom. Now read aloud. Why were certain records deleted before a DOJ visit? Why were complaints closed without review? Why did Ross approve training budgets that specifically reduced bias education? One witness, a former operations supervisor, answered the last question with a sigh. He said training was for optics, that loyalty mattered more. The courtroom did not gasp. It just grew still, because by now no one was surprised, only sad and exhausted. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury returned in one. Ross was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to 12 years without parole. He said nothing as the cuffs clicked closed, but outside a group of cadets from Southbridge stood quietly in uniform. One of them whispered, "That is what accountability looks like." The others said nothing. They just stood straighter. Back at home, Elise read the verdict in the paper. She circled one line and pinned it to her fridge. The culture of silence was not broken by volume. It was broken by steadiness. Later that week, she walked through the training facility she once helped design. The building had changed. Walls once bare now displayed quotes from community members. One read, "It should never take a general to prove a person's worth." Elise paused there. She read it twice. Then she walked into the observation room where a new class of recruits sat in silence as an instructor played footage from the funeral. Kleistus watched as Officer Dole raised his weapon. They watched as Elise stood still. The instructor asked, "What should have happened next?" A recruit replied, "He should have put the weapon down and asked her name." Another said, "He should have seen her before he saw a threat." The instructor nodded. "Then make sure you carry that answer into every room you enter." Elise stood behind the glass. She said nothing, but her eyes closed gently, and when they opened, she saw something she had not seen in a long time. Understanding. Not fear, not defense, just understanding. That evening, she sat with Clark on the back porch of her home. The sky was clear, the air still. He handed her a copy of the final review from the Federal Oversight Committee. "It is done," he said. "No more hearings, no more redactions, everything is public." Elise flipped through the pages. One line stood out.